archaeological finds to increase your Old Testament confidence. Hans Kristensen is our guest. It is the Pastor's Heart. Dominic Steele is my name. There are claims, and you hear them every so often, that archaeology has disproved this story or that in the Bible, claims about the Exodus, claims about Joshua, Jericho, and claims from this or that scholar about particularly late dating of different Bible books. How do we, as evangelical pastors, react, respond, answer those claims, and are they true? Today, an episode of The Pastor's Heart that will put confidence in your belly. We examine moments where archaeology and the Bible converge. Hans Kristensen is with us today on The Pastor's Heart. I first knew Hans when he was the hipster church planter at the suburb next door.
I'm not sure I was ever a hipster, but, that's okay.
He now leads the ministry at Marsfield Community Church in Sydney and is studying ancient history. Hans, it was something in your pastor's heart that led you to be deeply interested in the intersection between, if you like, archaeology and the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, and a frustration with what was happening with some of your peers.
Yeah, so just a bit of backstory. I think I first heard of archaeology and was inspired to think about archaeology from Indiana Jones, even though I wouldn't call him an archaeologist. He's more of a looter. But so there's that. And I had a great history teacher at high school. And in my early 20s, I went through a period of doubting the reliability of the New Testament, the Gospels, and whether Jesus rose from the dead. And I was helped by a guy named I.H. Marshall as I wrote to him, and he wrote back and said, read this and think about this. But when I started at Marsfield...
That's really cool. I remember reading his stuff, but it never occurred to me to write to him.
So what happened was I lived in Moree. I came down to Sydney for a concert, and as I was going back, it's an 11-hour train ride, I picked up a book from Dimmicks by a guy named John Shelby Spong, and Why Christianity Must Change or Die.
False teacher of the 80s.
Yeah. And Episcopal bishop who denied pretty much everything in the Bible. He went through, and one of the things he said was no major historian believes that the Gospels were true, they're historically reliable, that kind of thing, which really put my faith in a tailspin. And then I went to Moree Christian Bookstore, and in the 50-cent bin, there was I.H. Marshall's book, I Believe in the Historical Jesus. I read it, I wrote to him, and he kept writing, wrote back over about
Isn't
6 months.
Great that he took an interest in a country kid from...
I know, beautiful man. And when I've talked to other people who've known him, they just say, that's pretty typical. That's just what he did. He's just a humble, gracious man. I look forward to seeing him in glory. But when I moved to Marsfield, I caught up with some friends, and they had read some books on archaeology and history and the Old Testament, and listened to some scholars and some teachers. And they got to the point where they were like, I'm not sure if the Exodus happened. I'm not sure if the conquest happened. I'm not sure of this. And I tried to find a kind of a John Dixon level book on these issues, and there was nothing out there that I could find that was good and reputable. And I remember talking to Anthony Pedersen, who is an Old Testament lecturer at Morling, good friend of mine. And I said, mate, you need to write a book like this. He goes, mate, I wouldn't know where to start. And he said, well, why don't you write this book? I said, I can't do that. And he said, well, you can go to Macquarie Uni. I live 10 minutes from Macquarie Uni. You can study archaeology, history, the Bible, all that kind of stuff there. And over time, you'll amass knowledge that will be helpful for people. So that's kind of the journey, and it was to see my friends struggling with their faith.
This is pastors.
Yeah.
Struggling with their faith.
Yeah, there was a couple of pastors, there was a couple of lay people that just got to the point where they were like, I'm not sure I can. For the pastors, it was, I'm not sure if I can preach these parts of the Old Testament.
And some of the problem is the theological education they'd had.
Yeah, so some they had received some teaching, was directed to some to read some authors that
had undermined confidence in the scriptures.
Yeah, well, I think the problem was they were told that these authors are centrist, that they're not conservative like me on the Old Testament, but they're not really progressive. But this is where the field is. And really these guys were quite progressive, quite, I would say, left of the mark when it comes to where most scholars are at with the historicity of the Old Testament archaeology.
So how do we best start our thinking about archaeology, history, Bible?
Okay, the first thing to realize is that everyone's biased, right? So everyone's coming to archaeology, history, and the Bible with some kind of bias. Everyone. And I think the reason for that is the Bible is still in play. And what I mean by that is that the Bible is shaping people's lives. The Bible is still shaping political thought. The Bible is still, especially in America, one of these things that gets quoted a lot. And so you cannot come to the historicity of the Bible and be totally objective. I can come to, the historicity of Pharaoh's, wars.
And because it has no actual real impact on your life.
Exactly.
You really don't have a dog in that fight. Whereas actually everyone's got a dog in that fight because it all works towards whether or not God exists and how I should live today.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you are more on the progressive side of morality and politics, it does seem like you can almost map it out. The people who are more, the scholars that are more progressive in their politics, and you can see it on Twitter and Facebook and that kind of thing, are generally more skeptical of the reliability of the Old Testament.
What about when it comes up, there's a claim that archaeology has, disproved Jericho?
I mean, the first thing to say is there's very little archaeology can definitively prove and disprove. So I got
after all this study, that's what you've discovered.
It's frustrating. So I got into this thing going, man, I'll be able to prove this and that and this, and I was like, well, actually, I can't, because you take.
But they can't either.
They can't either. So when people say archaeology, let's take the Exodus for example, right? When people say archaeology has disproved the Exodus, the first question I want to ask is, what are our archaeological expectations? That is to say, when I read the book of Exodus, what should I expect to find in the archaeology, right? And so when you piece that out, when you ask that question, it sharpens what we're looking for, right? If you just say archaeology has disproved the book of Exodus or the event of the Exodus, well, it just seems very out there and nebulous. But now we're interacting and saying, okay, you've got to give me things that will that you think will disprove. And so I've heard people say, well, there's no record of the Exodus from the Egyptians, right? Mm-hmm. The problem with that is what we've got in Egypt is monumental records that glorify the pharaohs, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's no way a pharaoh would ever say, "Oh, by the way,
I had this big defeat."
We had this big defeat. It's a bit like if
we lost a third of our population.
Exactly. It'd be like Kamala Harris if she took a billboard out in the middle of Times Square and say, Isn't Donald Trump great? He's the victor. I lost. There's no way she's going to do it. There's no way an ancient pharaoh or any ancient ruler will do that. Other people have said, we've excavated the Sinai desert, and you look at that claim and you go, well, actually,
it's a big desert.
I think it's far bigger than Victoria, right?
Yeah.
And so what they've done is there's been certain work at the traditional sites of Mount Sinai, but the problem is it wasn't an excavation, right? It was basically a type of archaeological excavation. Well, not really excavation, where you're basically going over the surface and seeing if there's pottery there and things left behind. So you might be able to say, well, this pottery's from this time and therefore there's some people there. But there's 8 different places where Sinai could be, right? And so, there's all these things where when you dig down into it, it actually doesn't work. I'll give you another example if you want. The book of Joshua. Mm-hmm. The book of Joshua is probably the litmus test for a lot of people saying whether the Bible's true or not. And there was a great archaeologist called W.F. Albright. You might have heard of him. And he suggested in the early 1900s that what we should find, based on his reading of the book of Joshua, is in all these tells, in all these ancient tells, we should see these huge destruction layers because where the Israelites burned the cities and that kind of thing, right? And so we should see it all around. And so archaeologists went looking for these destruction layers around the time that we would expect Joshua, and they're not there. And so a lot of people go, well, that means the book of Joshua was wrong. But here's the problem. You read the book of Joshua and it says only 3 cities were burned: Jericho, Hatzor, and Ai. Right? And so what we're looking now for is destruction layers at 3 different cities, not the whole place. Also, Joshua says that God gave the Israelites places that they didn't build. They were going to tend to vineyards that they didn't plant. And so what you would expect is not that the Israelites come into Canaan. This is from the book of Joshua. You wouldn't expect the Israelites to come into Canaan and destroy everything, because God says, actually, you're going to actually inhabit these cities. So why would you destroy a city if you're going to inhabit it? So if we take the biblical books seriously and allow them to speak for themselves, then when we look at the archaeology, I think the archaeology doesn't give anywhere near a negative picture like a lot of critics would say it does.
What about when we hear or read that a narrative or story is dated much later than the events?
Yeah. You read that all the time, right? And I think that the first thing to say is, if you go to Moore College, where we both studied, I did this a few years ago, and I was studying Joshua at the time, and I picked up about 20 different commentaries on the book of Joshua, and they have a section that no pastors read generally, and because it's generally boring and it's useless for preaching, and that's the introduction, and they usually have a date.
Yeah.
And it was interesting.
Where the various commentators date
a book, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. People dated Joshua from the writing of Joshua from everywhere from about 1100 BC right down to 3 BC.
Wow.
And what they were mostly doing was saying, this is the ideology of a particular period. This is what was happening in a particular period. We see in the book of Joshua that these things were happening. There's some overlap here. Therefore, Joshua was written here. But the problem, scholars call that mirror reading, right? The problem with that is it's very subjective, right? You can mirror read the book of Joshua and you can say, well, it's from this period or that period or that period. And I won't bore you with going through the different periods and how Joshua could be written at these different times. The other thing is, what a lot of people are doing now is going with the Hebrew language, the development of the Hebrew language, and saying, biblical Hebrew only comes in at this time. The problem is there's huge debate around when biblical Hebrew came in, but also the implication is that these books, or the sources that they came from, couldn't be written earlier. And I think there's great evidence to say that there was writing in Israel a lot earlier than a lot of scholars would say, and therefore at least the sources could be written earlier. And so when you're dating a book, you've got to not have one or two arguments. There's got to be a multiplicity of arguments. And when scholars like a guy like Baruch Halpern, for example, when he dates biblical books, he uses all these different arguments. And when all the arguments come into play, when he's dating the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, for example, they're dated very, very early. Like they're dated he dates 1 and 2 Samuel about 50 to 100 years after David, which when you think about it is very early for ancient historical records.
Now, I'm going to give you these 10 bullet points in a moment, but just before then, our preaching. You've done this study. How do you think archaeology and history should impact just me as an everyday preacher?
Okay, so here's a mistake that I made, right? When I started, I was about to preach through the book of Kings, and I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a 5-minute section on why you can believe this bit of the Bible, right? And I bored everyone to tears, right? And I remember one lady coming up to me and saying, you don't need to do that. all that stuff about, can you believe this section? I said, well, why not? And I said, and she said, because it's boring. And anyway, we believe the Bible already. I said, but why do you believe the Bible? And she said, because my mum told me it was true, right? And I thought, that's great. So I wouldn't necessarily go into just putting random bits in there, especially if you don't know what you're talking about, right? There is a lot of misinformation out there, especially on YouTube, and I've heard preachers, and I myself has put in things that I've gone, I found out later that wasn't true. What I would suggest to preachers is to go to a website called BiblePlaces.com, and what you can do there is buy photographs of the different sections of books of the Bible. So you buy a bunch of photos from 1 Samuel, and what they've done is order the photos in every chapter. So you get 60 photos on 1 Samuel 1 and 60 and goes through, and it's got some commentary with that. And what I've been starting to use is those photos, a few of those photos through a sermon, just to say what we've got here is real people in real places in real times. This is real history. And so just
to move it out of the potential idea that this is kind of fairy tale.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're not making much of it, but you're just grounding it in history.
So for example, on Sunday, I preach on Joshua 5:13 through 15, where Joshua encounters the commander of the Lord's army. It's just out of Jericho. I had a photo of the Mount of Jericho, and I said, we know where Jericho is. This is real people, real places, real times. This is not Middle Earth. And then I moved on.
Right, that's great.
Yep.
Now, okay, we're going to go 10 points.
Yep.
It's going to be one-day cricket, fast shots.
Yep, sure. Let's go.
Big population jump in Canaan.
Yep.
Archaeological evidence at exactly the time that the Bible says he brought the people of Israel in.
Yeah. So just one thing I would nuance in what you said. There's two different dates for when scholars think the Exodus happened and the conquest happened. There's an early date around the 1400s. There's a late date around the 1200s. I hold to the late date around the 1200s. But what's really interesting is that in the early 1200s, 1100s, around there, what you see in the hill country of Israel, you see this population explosion.
We've got a map. Tell us about this map.
Yeah, so there's all these little dots on that map. And those are those dots are these little villages that just pop up, right?
From nowhere. As if somebody
nowhere.
just moved into the land.
Absolutely. Now, there are scholars who would say these guys were just low, some Canaanites who were in the plain, they moved up, but it's such a population explosion, and everyone says it's a population explosion, even if you're really skeptical of it, that they had to come from somewhere, right? And the Bible would say, well, they came from Egypt in the Exodus, and so there's much more to say about that, but I think that gives you a picture. That's a little archaeological fact, and it is a fact, the population explosion, that I think actually really works well with the Bible.
Now, from the 12th century, there's a record of the Egyptian pharaoh raiding the land of Canaan and saying Israelites were there.
Yeah. So a pharaoh named Meneptah, he was the pharaoh after Ramesses II. If you watch the Disney shows which talk about the Exodus, that's Ramesses II in all those Disney shows. Meneptah was a very old pharaoh. He wouldn't have gone into Israel himself. But he basically says Israel is laid waste and its seed is no more. Basically, wiped them out.
We've got the picture here of his. You tell us about that document.
It's called the Meneptah Stela or the Israel Stela. It's very famous, and it's got a line where it talks about Israel. Now, here's the thing: that does prove something. That proves that Israel is in the land of Canaan at the time that the Book of Judges says it is. Now, here's the other thing. In the Egyptian language or hieroglyphs, what they will do is use these things called determinatives. And they're just a few little symbols that kind of define an entity. And so the guy who wrote the Meneptah Stela, the scribe, uses the determinative of a people group. So Israel is not a state with a king at this time. It's a people group. Now, here's the thing. When you look at the book of Judges, what do you see in the book of Judges? You see a group of people who have no king. And so I think there is a convergence here between what we see in the book of Judges and the Merneptah Stela at this point.
My dad
Yep.
is an expert on Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Oh, well, there you go.
And so I'm looking forward to asking him about
Ask
this.
him, and I would love to hear what he says about it.
Number 3, in the city of Hazor, they've found religious idols destroyed.
Yep.
And, Joshua 11 and 12 said, Deuteronomy said, destroy those idols.
Yeah. So in Hatzor is one of the 3 places that Joshua said the Israelites burned: Hatzor, Ai, and Jericho, right? And so at Stratum, I think it's 12. There's this huge destruction layer. Like there's mounds of ash. The fire was so great that it turned some of the rock to glass. That was how hot it was, right? There's 2 really interesting things from this. One, that whoever burned it burnt the administrative center and also the religious part of it. When you have a look at the book of Joshua, but you also look at Deuteronomy, the Israelites were meant to go in and destroy the idols. The idols are all there; they're just destroyed. Now, in the ancient world, what you would do is you would take the idol as booty, but that's not what the Israelites were directed to do.
They smashed them up, and they were told to smash them up, and they did smash them up.
And so what we see in what we see in Hatzor is what we'd expect from Joshua and Deuteronomy: a huge destruction layer where smashed idols. And that's why there's 2 great archaeologists who were the main excavators of Hatzor, Yigal Yadin and Amnon Ben Tor, who both said this destruction is probably the Israelites.
Okay, number 4, the discovery of the altar at Mount Ebal is likely Joshua's altar.
Yeah, so in 1980...
We've got a photo of it here.
Yeah, great. Yeah, in 1980, a great archaeologist named Adam Zertal was doing a bunch of work in this area. He was, and he came across this structure. And he uncovered it, a structure on Mount Ebal. And what he found was it had all the hallmarks of an altar. So there's a lot of ash around from burning things. There was a lot of animal bones and that kind of thing, mostly kosher animal bones.
The stuff you'd expect Israelites to...
Exactly. And then when you have a look at Joshua 8, you see that they had an altar on Mount Ebal. And so Adam Zertal, I think, puts a convincing case that this is actually Joshua's altar.
Number 5, we now have evidence for King David's existence, and it's called the Tel Dan inscription.
Yeah, or the Tel Dan inscription. So up until 1992, there was no archaeological evidence that King David ever existed. And so in 1992, at the site of Tel Dan in the north of Israel, a bunch of great archaeologists uncovered in a wall 3 fragments of the Tel Dan inscription. And it's got a phrase on it, the House of David.
We've got a picture of that here.
Yep. And so the House of David. Now, this is a stela that was erected about 100 years after David. And so it shows you that the nation of Judah at this point is defining themselves by King David, right?
House of David,
Yeah. And so it doesn't prove much, but it definitely proves that there was a Judahite king named David who is extremely significant for Judah. It doesn't prove that David killed Goliath, no, but it actually proves that David existed and that he was a culturally significant king.
Now, you also talk in number 6 about consistent architectural town planning across the Israelite cities, as if there was one governor king who was saying, let's plan our towns like this.
Now, this is more...
it's a hypothesis, but it's interesting.
Yeah, okay. So about 10 years ago now, maybe a bit more, there was a place called Kirbet Kiafa that was excavated. And this is a very small site that it was overlooking the Elah Valley, right? And it really is a site that was around for maybe 50, maybe 100 years, right? Very, very, very ephemeral site. Now, what you see at that site is they've got the kind of architecture and town planning there that you see at other Judahite sites, right? And this is from the time of Saul David. And so what some archaeologists, and I tend to agree with them, would see the similarity in town planning, and also you see at some of these different sites there are Kirby, for example, there are ostracons. There's these little pieces of pottery with writing on there, which implies that, they're writing for a reason. You just don't write in your diary back then. There's probably administration functions there. And so what a lot of scholars have seen is that all these towns have the same architecture, the same religion. There's no iconography, religious iconography there. And it
consistent with Judaism.
Exactly. Yeah. It points to the fact that there's some kind of state functioning at this point. Now, this is debated. I want to say that this is debated, but I just tend to see that I'm won over by those arguments when I read those. So I think there is evidence of a small state around the time of David.
Now, number 7 is similarities between what we know of the Temple of Solomon and a similar temple that was built up near Beirut.
Yeah.
So it's consistent architecture of the day.
Yeah. So there's a temple called Ayan Dara. I may not be pronouncing that right, but it existed from 1300 BC to around 740 BC, right? And it, in terms of the layout and the size of each room, is almost an exact match to the Solomonic temple. In fact, what you see is there's other temples around the time of the Solomonic temple which are almost exactly alike. And here's the other thing that's really interesting. There's a skeptical archaeologist. He's pretty skeptical on a bunch of things, called William Dever. He's one of the greats of the field. And he's a guy who doesn't believe that Joshua happened, the conquest happened, the Exodus didn't happen. But he will say that every single thing that we read about the Solomonic temple in 1 Kings can be confirmed archaeologically. And so here's a couple of things. One, skeptical scholars will say that the Solomonic temple is a later idea, and they've just kind of made this up based on later ideas. Actually, if you take the archaeology, all the archaeology is from, or the archaeological remains that kind of correspond with the Solomonic temple are around the time of the Solomonic temple or before that. But here's an exegetical payoff. All the archaeological correlates are from pagan temples and pagan religion, which goes to show you that Solomon was very influenced by his wives. You don't just get to, I think it's 1 Kings 11, where it says he had a bunch of wives and they led him astray. You can actually see all the way through that Solomon is being led astray all the way through. 1 Kings, I think it's 3 to 10, and that's one of the bits of evidence.
Now, these chambered gates at Hazor, Megiddo, Giza, and their discovery corresponds with 1 Kings 9. Yeah,
so 1 Kings 9:15 says that Solomon built up Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, right? And what we find at Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer are these things, 6 chambered gates, and there's a photo coming up on the screen about them. And basically everyone says these are huge monumental gates which suggest an organised state, right? And so when I think it was Yigal Yadin once again saw these, he looked at these and said, this is a state, this corresponds with 1 Kings 9:15. And if you have a look, especially at Megiddo, the same level that this gate is on at Megiddo, you see a palace, you see other things. Now, I've got to say that there was an archaeologist named Israel Finkelstein. He's a great archaeologist, very skeptical of the Bible, very creative. Now he wants to date this architecture later, by about 100 years. But basically, there's no archaeologist that will really side with him. The majority of archaeologists think that his redating is absolutely wrong. So these gates, which a lot of archaeologists would say show state formation, are dated to the 10th century, which is around the time of Solomon, which shows, I think there's a correlation between 1 Kings 9:15 and these gates. Now, I would love to say that Solomon has written his name on there, so I was here. It's not that. We don't have that, but I think there's a good argument that can be made for it.
Let's go quickly, the last two.
Yep.
9th century battle from King Moab.
Yep.
And his account of that
Yep.
corresponds with 2 Kings 3.
Exactly. In 2 Kings 3, there is a coalition of Judah, Israel, who attacks Moab, King Mesha, and King Mesha has got his own stela, the Mesha stela, that it gives
We'll put that on the screen,
gives a parallel account of 2 Kings 3, which when you read them together, you would expect both are biased in certain ways, but they basically give the same account.
And then finally, the biblical chronology of the listed kings matches almost exactly with archaeological evidence.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that a number of the kings, whether they be Judahite or Israelite or foreign kings, are found in various inscriptions around the times that they were around, right? And what historians can do with those inscriptions is come up with a chronology of those, right? And then when you have a look at the chronology of the Bible, you actually see that the chronology of the Bible is actually extremely accurate, which shows, I think, that the biblical writers, 1 and 2 Kings, were using records that were contemporary with the kings that they were talking about, right? And they didn't mess with these records. They didn't mess with their sources and make stuff up. I think they were very conservative with those sources. And you actually can see evidence for that in the book of Kings, where it says, if you want to know more about this king, go and read this annal or that kind of thing. Those annals, I think this argument shows that they existed, that they were used, and that the historians of who wrote 1 and 2 Kings were very conservative in their handling of the sources.
Now, we should say you have a blog.
Yep.
We've put the link to that in the show notes.
Yep.
And we should say to Christian publisher, go and look at that blog, and then Hans will work with you to turn it into a book. And for the rest of us, we can go and read it for free now. Yeah.
So it's got a bunch of the essays that I've written for uni and a few other things on there. So, yeah.
And the heavy reading that you're recommending?
So there's 2 books. When pastors ask me, what are 2 books?
These are thick ones. I'm looking forward to your book.
Yeah. So the first one on the right is a book called Ancient Israel's History and Introduction to Issues and Sources. And it's written by a bunch of evangelical archaeologists and historians. And they basically they write an essay on each kind of section, the book of Judges or the period of the Judges. Excuse me. And it's actually really, really good. And so that's one I recommend. More on the apologetic side is this book. Kenneth Kitchen is a great evangelical Egyptologist, and it's got a lot of detail there. Just a warning with the book, he's very dismissive of other people's ideas in a way that I think is sinful. But if you can overlook that, it's a treasure trove of amazing information.
Great. So not that good on tone, but really good on facts.
Yep,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Great. Thanks so much for coming in and talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Hans Kristensen is our guest on The Pastor's Heart, and he is the senior pastor at Marsfield Community Church in Sydney. My name's Dominic Steele. We'll look forward to your company next Tuesday afternoon on The Pastor's Heart.